Good evening, beautiful viewer, and welcome once again. Find a quiet place. Let the world outside, with its intricate systems, its regulations, its web of connectivity, and its profound assumption of safety, fade away into a distant hum. Settle in wherever you might be listening from, whatever the hour on your clock. If you feel so inclined, leave a comment with the time and your location. Consider it a grounding ritual, a small anchor in the here and now, a final glance back at the solid shore before we push our small boat out into a vast, dark, and turbulent ocean. We are going to a place that lives vividly in our collective imagination, a place of myth and legend, of square-jawed heroes and black-hatted villains painted in bold, simple colors. But we are going behind the myth, behind the shimmering silver screen fantasies, to touch the raw, brutal, and terrifying reality of a world where law was a distant rumor, society was a fragile veneer, and survival was a daily, violent, and often crushingly lonely negotiation with 1,000 different ways to die. The story of the American West is, at its core, a story of two intertwined symbiotic voids. The first was a void of nature, a physical emptiness so vast, so primordial, so powerful that it dwarfed the human body and could shatter the human soul. The second was a void of law, a social and institutional emptiness that allowed human nature's darkest and most desperate impulses to flourish without consequence or restraint. These two voids were not separate forces, they fed each other in a grim, perpetual cycle. The savage indifference of the land created the perfect conditions for the savagery of man. To truly understand the dangers of the West, you must understand that every pioneer, every cowboy, every desperate soul who ventured past the Mississippi was fighting a war on two fronts simultaneously. A brutal, grinding campaign against a hostile landscape and a nervous, unpredictable guerrilla war against a lawless society. A defeat on one front almost always guaranteed a catastrophic defeat on the other. First, before any human threat, one had to contend with the land itself. It was the primary antagonist, an active, ever-present, and unimaginably powerful force. Its sheer, crushing, monolithic scale was a form of psychological warfare, a constant assault on the human sense of progress and purpose. A journey by wagon train from Missouri to Oregon was a 6-month odyssey through a profound emptiness where days would bleed into weeks and weeks into months, with no discernible change in the featureless, soul-numbing horizon. This tyranny of distance bred a deep, creeping hopelessness, a sense of insignificance that could curdle hope into despair and drive people to madness. The oppressive, unbroken silence of the plains, a silence so profound you could feel it pressing on your eardrums, was a constant reminder of your utter isolation. This immense landscape was a death trap of elemental forces. The search for water was a daily, agonizing obsession. The confident blue lines of rivers on the pioneers' cheap maps were often cruel jokes, leading to dry, sun-baked creek beds littered with the swollen carcasses of oxen and the discarded possessions of those who had come before. The notorious alkali water, shimmering deceptively in stagnant pools, was a beautiful poison, causing violent intestinal distress and a thirst that could not be quenched. To drink it was to die. Even good water could be a killer. The crowded, unsanitary campsites along the major trails quickly contaminated the rivers, turning them into vectors for cholera, the Blue Death, which could scythe through a wagon train in a matter of days, leaving a trail of hastily dug, shallow graves that wolves would uncover before the last wagon was out of sight. The weather was a thing of violent, theatrical extremes. The summers were a physical punishment of brain-baking heat and choking, alkaline dust that inflamed the lungs. The thunderstorms were biblical, the lightning striking the flat earth with impunity. The winter blizzards were roaring, instantaneous whiteouts that could drop the temperature by 70 degrees in hours, freezing a man solid just yards from his own door, his body a rigid statue not to be found until the spring thaw. The very earth resisted them, the prairie sod a tough, tangled armor that shattered their plows. This was the elemental danger, a world that did not care if you lived or died, and it possessed an infinite and patient capacity to ensure the latter. And this natural void, This immense, uncrossable distance and the isolation it created directly nurtured the second void, the almost total absence of law. In the settled East, the law was a vast, interconnected system. In the West, it was a cruel fiction. A county sheriff in the Arizona Territory might be theoretically responsible for a jurisdiction the size of a European nation. His authority was a line on a map, rendered meaningless by the reality of the landscape. A murder or a cattle theft committed 100 miles from the county seat was an act committed with near-perfect impunity. By the time a report reached the sheriff, if it ever did, and he could gather a posse, if he could find one, the perpetrators were long gone, swallowed by the immense wilderness which served as the criminal's greatest ally. This vacuum of authority, this absolute certainty that consequences were a distant and unlikely possibility, created a culture where the only law that mattered was the law of the gun. This culture was catalyzed and armed by a technological revolution. The end of the Civil War and new inventions unleashed a torrent of efficient, lethal firearms into the civilian population. For the first time in human history, the reliable, self-contained metallic cartridge, fired from a repeating Winchester rifle or a Colt Peacemaker revolver, made lethal force easily accessible, portable, and terrifyingly efficient. This democratization of lethality meant that any dispute, no matter how trivial, could become a fatal one. The cinematic myth of the high noon gunfight is a lie. The reality was a sudden, chaotic, and clumsy explosion of violence in a smoky, crowded saloon where an argument over a card game could leave 3 men dead and 2 innocent bystanders bleeding on the floorboards. This environment was a powerful magnet for predators. The West became the great refuge for men running from the law, from their pasts, from the psychological wreckage of a brutal war that had hardened them to violence and death. It was a place where a man's history was his own business, and where a fast gun and a notable lack of conscience were valuable assets. This gave rise to organized outlaw gangs like the James Younger Gang or the Dalton Gang, not romantic rebels but ruthless parasites who would terrorize a town, murdering unarmed civilians to create panic before robbing a bank. But far more common, and in many ways more terrifying, was the random, opportunistic violence of the road. The lonely trails between isolated settlements were hunting grounds for road agents who would kill for a horse, a pocket watch, or a pair of boots. Every stranger on the trail was a potential threat. Every campfire was a beacon for potential death. And the two dangers, natural and human, were in a constant, deadly dialogue. They were not separate challenges. They were a single, interwoven ecosystem of death. A broken axle on a rough, rocky trail, a common victim of the landscape, would strand a family's wagon. Their immobility, a consequence of the natural world, made them a perfect, helpless target for opportunistic bandits, a crime made possible by the legal void. A harsh winter that killed off half a cattle baron's herd, an act of nature, would force him to recoup his losses by aggressively expanding his grazing territory. He would then hire a gang of regulators or a corrupt sheriff to drive smaller homesteaders off their land with threats, beatings, and murder, a human conflict directly fueled by a natural disaster. A prospector, driven by gold fever, would endure months of isolation and hardship in the mountains. The land would test him with starvation, predators, and brutal weather. If he survived and was lucky enough to find a rich strike, his success would instantly make him a target. The very isolation the land had forced upon him, which had been his shield, now became his greatest vulnerability, ensuring there were no witnesses when a rival slit his throat for his pouch of gold dust. The land offered the prize and simultaneously guaranteed his inability to protect it. And then there was the ultimate perversion, the point where the two voids became one, the danger that wore a badge. In this vacuum, the distinction between a lawman and a criminal was often a matter of who was currently holding the office. A sheriff's position was often fee-based, incentivizing corruption. He could be the silent partner of the town's most powerful saloon owner or the hired gun of a cattle baron. In notorious towns like Tombstone, rival political and economic factions would each hire their own lawmen, pinning tin stars on known gunmen to give their violence a veneer of legality. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral was not a simple battle of good versus evil. It was a violent collision between two such deputized gangs. For the average, unarmed citizen, the man with the badge could be the most dangerous man of all, for his violence came with the color of authority. This was the fundamental, terrifying reality of the West. It was not a choice between facing a blizzard or facing a gunman. It was a world where the blizzard might force you into the very saloon where the gunman was waiting. It was a world where you could survive a rattlesnake bite, a flash flood, and a stampede, only to be shot in the back for the very boots that had carried you through it all. The dangers were not separate. They were a single, interwoven system, a brutal feedback loop where the indifference of the land bred the violence of men, and the violence of men was just one more brutal, unpredictable, and deadly feature of the landscape. Beyond the vast, impersonal dangers of the landscape and the sharp, unpredictable threat of human violence, there lay another, more intimate and perhaps more pervasive theatre of peril, the world of work. For the overwhelming majority of people who ventured into the West, life was not a series of dramatic gunfights or heroic confrontations. It was a daily, relentless, and physically crushing grind, a brutal, monotonous struggle to extract a living from an unyielding environment. And this work, romanticized in national myth as the rugged, noble expression of American individualism, was in reality a realm of extraordinary, constant, and often horrifically mundane fatality. The West was a land that maimed, crippled, and killed its workers with a cold, industrial indifference long before the first shot of a feud was ever fired. The cowboy, the miner, and the railroad worker, the three iconic figures of Western labor, each faced a unique and terrifying set of daily threats that made a violent death by human hands seem almost like a statistical afterthought. Their lives were not adventures. They were a slow-motion battle for survival against their own jobs. Let us first consider the cowboy, the most potent and mythologized figure of all. We picture him as the ultimate free spirit, a master of his domain, a philosopher on horseback alone with his thoughts under a wide and starry sky. The reality was a life of grueling, low-paid, and incredibly dangerous seasonal labor, punctuated by moments of sheer, heart-stopping terror. The central event of the cowboy's life, the crucible in which his reputation was forged, was the long cattle drive, the epic multi-month journey of moving thousands of head of semi-wild, notoriously nervous longhorn cattle from the vast breeding grounds of Texas to the railheads in Kansas or Wyoming. This was not a peaceful procession. It was a constant, 2,000-mile battle against chaos. The greatest and most immediate fear, the nightmare that haunted every man on the trail, was the stampede. Longhorn cattle were creatures of pure, instinctual panic. Anything could set them off in the dead of night. The howl of a distant wolf, a clap of thunder from a dry lightning storm, the scent of a predator on the wind, even a clumsy cowboy dropping a tin cup by the campfire. A stampede was a sudden, explosive roar in the absolute darkness. The sound of 8,000 hooves pounding the earth into a drum, a living earthquake of horn and hide and muscle moving at 30 miles an hour with no direction but blind terror. The cowboy on night watch had a split second to react. His training, his entire purpose, was to ride not away from this terrifying wave of death, but directly alongside it. He had to get to the front of the herd, to the lead steers, firing his pistol into the air next to their heads, yelling until his throat was raw, trying to turn them, to force the entire herd to begin circling in on itself in a tight, confused mill until it exhausted its panic. To fail was to die in one of the most horrific ways imaginable. If his horse, running full tilt in the pitch black over treacherous ground, stumbled in a prairie dog hole, or was gored by the razor-sharp horn of a steer, both horse and rider would be instantly swallowed by the herd, trampled into a bloody, unrecognizable pulp by thousands of hooves. Every cowboy knew men who had simply vanished in a night stampede, their remains, a boot, a shattered saddle, a few bone fragments, found days later, if at all. The great rivers of the plains were another constant, deadly obstacle. The Red, the Brazos, the Platte, these were not gentle streams, but wide, muddy, and unpredictable torrents that had to be crossed. There were no bridges. The cattle, terrified of the water, had to be forced in, and they often panicked midstream. The cowboy's job was to be in the churning, debris-filled water with them, on his horse, swimming alongside the terrified animals, pushing them, guiding them, keeping the herd from turning back or swimming in circles until they drowned from exhaustion. The water was often a thick, cold, muddy soup, its currents treacherous. A horse could lose its footing and be swept away, taking its rider down with it. A cowboy could be kicked by a flailing hoof, his skull fractured, and be lost beneath the brown water. Or he could fall victim to the river's most insidious danger, quicksand. The shifting beds of these prairie rivers were riddled with patches of sucking, bottomless sand that could trap a horse and its rider in a matter of seconds. The more they struggled, the faster they would sink, pulled down into a slow, suffocating, and terrifyingly conscious grave. Beyond these moments of high drama was the daily, grinding attrition of injuries that would fester and kill in a world without medicine. A simple fall from a skittish horse could result in a broken leg. In the civilized East, this was a painful inconvenience. On a cattle drive 500 miles from the nearest town with a doctor, a compound fracture was a death sentence. With no way to properly set the bone, infection was almost inevitable. The only treatment was a long swig of whiskey for courage and a crude amputation with a dirty handsaw and a branding iron to cauterize the stump. Gangrene was the likely outcome. Even smaller injuries, a deep rope burn from a lariat, a puncture wound from a mesquite thorn, a kick from a horse, could become fatally infected in the dusty, unsanitary conditions of the trail, leading to blood poisoning and a slow, feverish death in the back of the chuck wagon. The cowboy's life was a litany of broken bones, hernias, and chronic ailments caused by a monotonous diet of beans and bacon, constant exposure to the elements, and sheer, bone-deep exhaustion. He was often considered old by 30 and was frequently dead or crippled by 40. The miner, drawn west by the siren song of gold and silver, faced a different but equally lethal workplace. Whether he was a solitary prospector panning a stream or a wage worker in a deep-shaft industrial mine, death was his constant, silent partner. The deep-shaft mines of places like the Comstock Lode in Nevada or Cripple Creek in Colorado were subterranean death traps, industrial slaughterhouses where human life was the cheapest and most expendable commodity. The single greatest danger was the cave-in. The mining techniques were crude, the timbering used to support the hundreds of miles of tunnels often haphazard and insufficient under the immense pressure of the earth. The tunnels would groan and shift without warning, and a sudden collapse could entomb dozens of men instantly under thousands of tons of rock, their bodies never to be recovered. Those not killed immediately would face the ultimate horror, being trapped in the absolute, silent, suffocating darkness, their air slowly thinning, their faint cries for help unheard 1,000 feet above on the surface. Explosions were another constant threat. The use of unstable, newly invented nitroglycerin and early forms of dynamite to blast through solid rock was an art of terrifying imprecision. A miscalculation in the length of a fuse, a stray spark from a pickaxe striking a rock, or simply the volatile nature of the explosives themselves could trigger a catastrophic blast that would rip through the tunnels, killing men with the concussive force, the subsequent collapse, or the poisonous afterdamp gases that silently filled the shafts, suffocating any survivors. And then there was the heat. In the deep geothermal shafts of the Comstock Lode, miners encountered vents of superheated water that could raise the temperature in the tunnels to 130 degrees Fahrenheit or more. Men worked in these hellish, sulfurous conditions, stripped to the waist, their bodies drenched in sweat, able to work for only 15 minutes at a time before retreating to a cooling station. Heatstroke was common and deadly, and for those who survived the daily risks of explosion, collapse, and heat, a slower death awaited. Miners' consumption, or silicosis, was a deadly lung disease caused by years of inhaling fine rock dust. The silica particles would slowly, inexorably turn a man's lungs into a solid, useless, stone-like mass, leading to a painful, hacking, suffocating death. The mine owners viewed the miners as utterly expendable. There was always a fresh supply of desperate men, Irish, Cornish, Chinese, willing to risk their lives for a few dollars a day. A miner's life was cheap, and his grave was often the very shaft in which he toiled. The cowboy stands as the central, sun-bleached, and almost sacred icon of the American West. He is a figure so profoundly mythologized, so thoroughly reimagined by dime novels and cinema, that he seems to ride beyond the grasp of grubby, historical reality. We see him as the stoic hero, the quiet guardian of the herd, the laconic embodiment of a simple, rugged, and unshakable moral code. He is freedom personified. But this romantic image, perhaps the most powerful in American folklore, is a carefully constructed mirage, a nostalgic fiction that obscures a much darker, more violent, and more complex truth. The historical cowboy of the Great Trail Drive era, roughly 1866 to 1890, was often a very young man, sometimes a boy, of only 15 or 16, frequently illiterate, deeply impoverished, and profoundly marginalized. He was not a lawman, nor was he necessarily a born outlaw. He existed, and his entire culture was forged in the vast, grey, lawless space between the two. The very nature of his brutal work, his precarious social standing, and the cruel economic realities of his life placed him in constant, intimate contact with the world of crime. Sometimes as its victim, often as its perpetrator, and almost always as a participant in a culture where the line between legal and illegal was as faint, shifting, and easily erased as a trail in a dust storm. The cattle drive itself, the seminal experience of the cowboy's life, was the incubator for this profound duality. Imagine the conditions. For 3, 4, sometimes 5 months, a small group of 15 to 20 young men, all heavily armed as a matter of course, would be completely removed from any semblance of civilized society. They saw no towns, no churches, no schools, no women other than perhaps a distant homesteader's wife glimpsed from a mile away. Their only law was the unwritten, brutally pragmatic code of the trail and the absolute dictatorial authority of the trail boss. This intense, shared isolation, punctuated by moments of terror and weeks of mind-numbing boredom, forged powerful, almost unbreakable bonds of loyalty within the outfit. The outfit was their family. The brand of the cattle they drove was their flag. The herd was their nation, and anyone or anything outside of that moving, bovine world, anyone who impeded their progress or questioned their methods, was viewed with a deep and immediate suspicion, if not outright hostility. This tribal, almost feral mindset was essential for surviving the hardships of the trail, but it became profoundly dangerous when it collided with the burgeoning, settled world. The most common and violent point of collision was with the homesteaders, the nesters, the dirt farmers who were attempting to claim and fence off the great open range over which the cattle herds had traditionally moved. To the cowboy, a barbed wire fence was not just an obstacle, it was a personal affront, a declaration of war, an existential threat to his very way of life and his concept of freedom. The conflicts that arose from this fundamental clash of civilizations were not legal disputes to be settled in a courtroom. They were a form of low-grade, undeclared, and brutally one-sided warfare. Cowboy crews would routinely carry wire cutters as standard equipment. At night, they would ride the perimeter of a new homestead and systematically cut every strand of a farmer's painstakingly erected fence, allowing their thousands of hungry cattle to pour through, trampling a family's entire crop of corn or wheat into the dirt, destroying a year's work and a family's hope of survival in a single night. This was not seen as a crime. In the cowboys' moral universe, it was a justifiable, even righteous, defense of their customary rights to grass and water. The intimidation often escalated. If a homesteader's dog barked at the herd, it would be shot without a second thought. If the homesteader himself became too vocal, if he tried to organize his neighbors in protest, he could be subjected to a campaign of terror designed to drive him off his claim. A dozen cowboys might pay a visit to his remote sod house late at night, circling the flimsy dwelling, firing their pistols into the air, or worse, into the thin sod walls, while the terrified family huddled inside. They might lasso his only milk cow and drag it to death for sport. In extreme cases, a homesteader who refused to be intimidated could simply disappear, his death attributed to Indian trouble, a snakebite, or a convenient accident. This was organized, economically motivated crime, but it was crime sanctioned by the powerful cattle barons who owned the herds, and it was carried out by young men who saw themselves not as criminals, but as soldiers in a just war for the soul of the West. Theft was another constant, woven into the very fabric of the cattle business itself. The concept of mavericking, claiming an unbranded, motherless calf found wandering on the open range, began as an accepted, if fuzzy, custom. But it quickly and inevitably devolved into a common euphemism for rustling. A cowboy working for a large ranch might maverick a calf for his boss, but the temptation to start a small, personal herd on the side was immense. It was a simple matter to quietly apply one's own small, discreet brand, a road brand, to a few unbranded calves discovered far from any prying eyes. This was the first, easy step on a very slippery slope. The next was to alter an existing brand, a craft of considerable illegal artistry. Using a heated running iron, a skilled rustler could cleverly change a C into a full O, add a tail to an R to make it a B, or turn an F into an E. This was a hanging offense in many parts of the West, but it was incredibly common, and its morality was deeply ambiguous. The great cattle barons themselves were often the biggest rustlers of all, the respectable men who had built their vast empires by absorbing the herds of smaller ranchers through a combination of legal chicanery, predatory loans, and the brute force of their hired cowboys. For a young, ambitious cowboy, the line between working for a famous cattle king and working for a notorious rustling kingpin was often non-existent. The work was identical, only the brand on the iron was different. But the most explosive and revealing intersection of the cowboy and the world of crime occurred at the end of the trail, in the notorious, purpose-built, hell-on-wheels cattle towns of Kansas and Nebraska, places like Abilene, Dodge City, and Ogallala. After months of grueling work, mind-numbing boredom, constant danger, and enforced sobriety, a cowboy would be paid off in a single lump sum of cash, perhaps $60 or $70, a small fortune to him. A flood of young, armed, and socially isolated men with 3 months' wages burning a hole in their pockets and a desperate, explosive thirst for sensory release would pour into a town that was, in essence, a complex parasitic ecosystem designed specifically to fleece them. The entire economy of a cattle town was built on the art and science of separating the cowboy from his money as quickly, efficiently, and ruthlessly as possible. The moment he rode into town, he was a mark. He would head straight for the saloons, which were far more than just bars. They were sprawling, noisy, brilliantly lit entertainment complexes offering cheap, potent whiskey of dubious quality, rigged gambling games of every description, and the services of prostitutes, the soiled doves. The social dynamic was a powder keg. The cowboys, still operating with the fierce tribal loyalty of their outfit, would often clash with cowboys from rival outfits, or with the slick, predatory professional gamblers and the hardened, town-taming lawmen who viewed them with undisguised contempt. A drunken argument over a woman, a perceived insult, an accusation of cheating at faro or poker could instantly erupt into a chaotic, close-quarters gunfight. The long-barreled Colt revolver, a necessary tool of the trade on the trail, became a deadly liability in a crowded, alcohol-fueled room. The cowboy was a predator on the range, but he was the prey in the town. He was systematically and expertly cheated by professional gamblers, or card sharps, men who were masters of the marked card, the stacked deck, and the hidden holdout device. He was robbed by prostitutes who would often work with a male accomplice in a panel game, where a sliding panel in the wall of a cheap hotel room would allow a thief to rifle through the cowboy's pockets while he was distracted. He would then be unceremoniously thrown out into the alley, drugged and penniless. Finally, he could be arrested by a town marshal, often a hired gun himself on the town's payroll, for trivial offences like discharging a firearm within city limits or public intoxication. He would be held in the town jail overnight and released the next morning after paying a fine that, by a strange and recurring coincidence, just happened to be the exact amount of money he had left in his pockets. The town's entire legal and commercial apparatus was a finely tuned criminal enterprise aimed squarely at him. It is no surprise, then, that many cowboys, after being systematically cheated, robbed, beaten, and extorted, would simply cross the line themselves. A man who had just lost his entire stake in what he knew was a rigged card game might decide to simply take it back at gunpoint. A crew of cowboys, feeling they had been unjustly fleeced by a town, might decide to tree the town, to take it over for a night, riding up and down the main street, yipping and yelling, shooting out the lights and the windows of the businesses that had cheated them, terrorizing the very citizens and merchants who had preyed upon them until a posse of armed townsfolk could be organized to drive them out. And for some, this cycle of brutal work and systematic victimization was the final push. After a few seasons of enduring the hardships of the trail, only to have his wages stolen from him in a debauched 3-day spree, a cowboy might look at the life of an outlaw and see it not as a moral failing, but as a logical, even preferable, career move. Why work for $1 a day for a cattle baron who exploited him, only to have it all stolen by the crooks in town? Why not go into business for himself? The skills were perfectly transferable. A man who could ride for days on end, survive in the wilderness, handle a gun with confidence, and possessed a hardened indifference to violence was already halfway to being a professional outlaw. Gangs led by figures like Billy the Kid in the Lincoln County War, or the members of the Wild Bunch, were often heavily populated by ex-cowboys who had simply decided that if the whole system was crooked, they might as well be on the side that offered better pay and more autonomy. They saw themselves not as common criminals, but as rebels against a corrupt system, a system of powerful cattle companies that exploited their labor and crooked towns that stole their wages. The cowboy, therefore, was not a simple hero. He was a complex and often tragic figure, a young man trapped in a brutal economic system that actively pushed him toward criminality at every turn. He was a victim of the land's hardships, a perpetrator of crimes against those weaker than himself, and a willing participant in the violent, alcohol-fueled culture of the cattle towns. The line he walked was not between good and evil, but between the hard, dangerous work of branding another man's cattle and the equally hard, dangerous work of stealing them. For many, it was a line that was all too easy to cross. Beyond the organized, economically motivated criminality of the outlaw gangs who preyed upon the arteries of commerce, and beyond the ambiguous, situational violence of the cowboy culture, there existed a far more terrifying, pervasive, and intimate form of lawlessness. This was the danger that did not come riding into town with guns blazing, but that which festered quietly, like a gangrenous wound, behind the closed, unpainted door of a remote, isolated sod cabin. It was the danger that lurked in the suffocating, candle-lit silence of a high-altitude mining camp after a whiskey-fueled card game went wrong. And it was the danger that exploded in the heart of a fledgling community that had decided, in a fit of collective, righteous rage, to take the raw power of life and death into its own hands. This was the deeply personal world of domestic violence, the slow, creeping, and horrifying madness of profound isolation, and the brutal, ritualized, and often profoundly hypocritical terror of vigilante justice. These were dangers that were rarely recorded in the heroic, male-centric annals of the West, dangers that have been almost entirely erased from the heroic myth. Yet they represented a daily, horrifying, and inescapable reality for thousands, particularly for the women, the children, and the marginalized ethnic minorities who were most vulnerable in a world utterly devoid of legal recourse, social protection, or compassionate witnesses. The idealized image of the Western family, a vision immortalized in romantic literature and nostalgic art, is one of the most enduring and deeply deceptive fictions of the era. We picture the stoic, hard-working homesteader, his jaw set in noble determination, the resilient, endlessly patient and pious mother, her hands worn from labor but her spirit unbroken. their cherubic, sun-kissed children all working in harmonious concert to build a new Eden from the prairie sod. This image is a lie. The reality was that the very conditions that defined the homesteader's life, the profound, soul-crushing isolation, the immense and relentless physical hardship, the constant gnawing threat of catastrophic failure, and the complete and utter lack of any social or institutional safety net, created a perfect, hermetically sealed pressure cooker for domestic abuse. Imagine the setting. A family on a remote homestead in the Dakota Territory or western Kansas could be 50 miles or more from their nearest neighbor, a distance that might as well have been 1,000 in a world without roads or communication. Their home was often a one-room hovel built from the tough prairie sod itself. It was a dark, damp, dirt-floored dwelling, cool in the summer but cold and miserable in the winter, constantly leaking mud from the ceiling during a rainstorm, and chronically infested with insects, spiders, snakes, and vermin. In this claustrophobic, earthen tomb, a man broken by the relentless, heartbreaking struggle against the land could easily become a monster. A man who had watched his entire crop of wheat, the product of a year of back-breaking labor, be obliterated by a 5-minute hailstorm. A man who had seen his small, precious herd of cattle freeze to death in a single brutal blizzard. A man whose dreams of independence and prosperity had turned to bitter, alkaline dust. This man, filled with a rage he could not direct at the indifferent sky or the unyielding earth, would instead turn his explosive fury inward. He would strike out at the only people over whom he had absolute, unquestioned, and legally sanctioned power: his wife and his children. Alcohol, readily available and consumed in staggering quantities as a cheap, potent, and temporary escape from the bleakness and monotony of daily life, was a powerful and predictable accelerant. A drunken, desperate, and failed man in a one-room sod house became an absolute tyrant in a tiny, inescapable kingdom. The stories, when they surface in the rare, treasured surviving diaries of pioneer women or in the terse, unemotional records of a frontier divorce court, are grim and heartbreakingly repetitive. They tell of beatings with fists, with leather belts, with pieces of firewood, often for the most trivial of perceived offenses: a burnt meal, a crying child, a moment of perceived disrespect. They tell of a constant, grinding emotional abuse, a relentless barrage of blame and resentment in the suffocating confines of a home from which there was no exit. For a woman trapped in this nightmare, there was no concept of reporting the abuse. To whom would she report it? The distant sheriff, who would likely view it as a private, family matter and tell her it was her wifely duty to obey her husband. Her only option was to endure it, to pray for a change in her husband's fortunes or his heart, or to take the ultimate, desperate risk, to flee on foot with her children in tow into a wilderness that was, in its own way, just as dangerous and as likely to kill her as the man she was leaving behind. This profound psychological pressure of isolation was a danger in itself, a slow, creeping erosion of the mind. The prairie madness, or prairie fever, was a well-documented phenomenon, a slow-motion mental breakdown caused by the crushing monotony, the profound loneliness, and the acute sensory deprivation of life on the Great Plains. Imagine the inputs to the human brain, the endless, featureless, perfectly flat horizon that offered no point of reference, no sense of progress, no verticality to break the oppressive, horizontal tyranny. Imagine the ceaseless, high-pitched, nerve-shredding whine of the wind that never, ever stopped, a sound that could wear down the sanest mind. This, combined with the stark lack of color, the social isolation, and the constant, low-grade anxiety of survival, was a devastatingly effective recipe for clinical depression, crippling anxiety, and, in extreme cases, a complete psychotic break. People would be found wandering the prairie, miles from their homes, talking to themselves, their eyes vacant and unseeing. Others would simply retreat into a catatonic silence, sitting in a corner of their soddy for days on end, refusing to eat or speak, lost to a world no one else could reach. And sometimes this quiet, insidious madness would turn spectacularly and horrifically violent. A quiet, withdrawn homesteader, a man described by his few distant neighbors as a good, hard-working man, would suddenly and inexplicably snap, He would murder his entire family with an axe or a rifle as they slept, then set fire to his own cabin and take his own life. The horrific act would be discovered only weeks or even months later by a passing traveler or a cowboy who noticed the eerie silence, the untended livestock, and the flies buzzing around the door of the burned-out hovel. This was not the work of a greedy outlaw. It was the tragic, monstrous culmination of a mind slowly, silently, and inexorably eroded by the terrible, silent pressures of the land and the loneliness it imposed. In the mining camps and boomtowns, a different kind of social rot took hold, one born not of isolation, but of a chaotic, hyper-masculine and lawless hyper-concentration of humanity. These were not communities in any traditional sense. They were violent, temporary, and pathologically unstable gatherings of thousands of single men drawn from every corner of the globe. Discharged soldiers, failed farmers, fugitives from Eastern justice, men from Ireland, Cornwall, China, Mexico, and Germany, all consumed by a single, obsessive, and feverish pursuit, the frantic acquisition of wealth. They were societies almost entirely without the civilizing, moderating influence of women, children, families, churches, schools, or civic groups. This created an atmosphere of intense, paranoid competition, rampant racial and ethnic friction, and stunningly casual brutality. We have explored the vast, impersonal dangers of the land, the sharp, opportunistic violence of the lawless individual, and the quiet, desperate horrors that unfolded behind the closed doors of the homestead and in the rage of the vigilante mob. But there was another category of danger, one that was arguably the most terrifying of all because it was systemic, officially sanctioned, and carried out not in defiance of the law, but often with its full, enthusiastic, and righteous backing. This was the danger of being on the wrong side of progress. The grand, sweeping, and almost religious narrative of the 19th century American West is the story of manifest destiny, the powerful, intoxicating belief that the United States had a divinely ordained right and an imperative national duty to expand its dominion, its institutions, and its Anglo-Saxon civilization across the entire continent, from sea to shining sea. In the minds of its proponents, this was not conquest. It was destiny, it was providence, it was the natural, inevitable, and morally righteous unfolding of history. But for the people who already inhabited that land, the hundreds of distinct Native American tribes, and for the other, non-white peoples who were drawn into its orbit by the lure of gold or the demand for labor, like the Chinese immigrants, this destiny was not a shining promise. It was a terrifying existential threat, a slow-motion, multi-generational apocalypse that aimed, with cold and calculated precision, to erase their way of life, to seize their land, and, if necessary, to extinguish their very existence. The danger faced by the Native American tribes of the Great Plains, the Great Basin, and the Southwest was the most profound and absolute, for they stood directly in the path of the expansionist juggernaut. For centuries, their cultures had existed in a complex, deeply symbiotic and spiritual relationship with the land. For the tribes of the Great Plains, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, the Kiowa, this relationship was personified by the American bison, or buffalo. The bison was not merely an animal, it was their mobile commissary, their hardware store, their church. It provided everything: the meat that was their primary sustenance, the thick hides that were used for clothing, for the sacred shields of the warrior societies, and for the warm, durable coverings of their teepees, the bones that were fashioned into tools, knives, and war implements, the sinew that was used for thread and bowstrings, even the dried dung, the buffalo chips, which was the primary source of fuel on the treeless plains. The entire culture of the Plains tribes, their nomadic, migratory lifestyle, their warrior ethos, their complex spiritual beliefs, their social structure, was built around the great, thundering, migratory herds. The arrival of the white settlers, and particularly the transformative power of the railroad, represented a catastrophic disruption of this ancient, life-sustaining cycle. The United States government, along with the powerful commercial and military interests behind it, quickly and cynically realized that the most effective way to pacify the tribes and force them onto reservations was not to defeat their elusive and brilliant warriors in battle, but to destroy their food source. And so began one of the most shameful and brutally effective campaigns of ecological warfare in modern history, the Great Slaughter of the Bison. This was not a hunt, it was a systematic, industrial-scale extermination. The railroads, pushing their iron tentacles across the plains, actively encouraged and facilitated it. They ran special hunting excursions where wealthy Eastern tourists and European nobles could shoot bison by the hundreds directly from the windows of their moving train cars, leaving the magnificent animals to bleed out and rot on the prairie, their deaths serving as a form of casual, bloody entertainment. Professional hide hunters, armed with powerful, long-range, large-caliber Sharps rifles, descended on the plains like a plague. A skilled hunter could kill 200 or more animals in a single day, firing from a concealed position and wiping out an entire grazing herd. The skinners would then move in, taking only the valuable hide and perhaps the tongue, a delicacy, leaving mountains of meat to putrefy under the sun. Men like Buffalo Bill Cody were hired by the Kansas Pacific Railroad to kill bison by the thousands to feed the huge crews of track-laying laborers. The scale of the slaughter is almost impossible to comprehend and represents a crime against nature that is staggering to contemplate. In the early 1800s, the bison population was conservatively estimated to be as high as 30 to 60 million. By the late 1880s, a single generation later, fewer than 1,000 of these animals remained in the wild. The vast, thundering herds that had been a force of nature, so numerous they could take days to pass a single point, were reduced to scattered, bewildered, and genetically unviable handfuls. For the Plains tribes, this was the end of the world. It was a deliberate, calculated act of starvation, a policy designed to break their spirit by breaking their bodies. A Kiowa chief named 10 Bears, in a famous and heartbreaking speech at the Medicine Lodge Treaty Council, articulated the despair. "I was born upon the prairie where the wind blew free and there was nothing to break the light of the sun. I was born where there were no enclosures and where everything drew a free breath. I want to die there and not within walls. But it is too late. The white man has the country we loved, and we only wish to wander on the prairie until we die." When the tribes, faced with starvation, the loss of their entire way of life, and the violation of sacred treaties, resisted, when they fought back with skill and courage to defend their lands and their families, they were systematically branded as hostile savages. This label was a crucial and incredibly effective piece of propaganda. It dehumanized them in the eyes of the American public, stripping them of their legitimate grievances and casting them as an irrational, bloodthirsty, and pagan obstacle to the march of Christian civilization. It justified a policy of total war. The US Army, filled with hardened Civil War veterans and led by ambitious officers, was deployed not to keep the peace, but to enforce the reservation policy through overwhelming and often indiscriminate violence. The official rules of engagement frequently went out the window. The army attacked not just warriors, but entire villages, often in the dead of winter when the people were at their most vulnerable, their food stores low, their ponies weak. Events like the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, where a Colorado militia under Colonel John Chivington attacked a peaceful camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho under Chief Black Kettle, who were flying an American flag and a white flag of truce, were not isolated incidents. The militia slaughtered hundreds of women, children, and elderly people, mutilating their bodies in a horrific frenzy of racial hatred. The Bear River Massacre, the Washita Massacre, the Wounded Knee Massacre, the litany of names tells a story of a brutal, one-sided policy of subjugation. The danger for a Native American was simply existing. To be a free Indian off the designated reservation was to be considered hostile, a target to be hunted down and killed or captured by the army or by civilian Indian fighters. Even for those who surrendered and accepted the grim reality of life on the reservations, the danger did not end. It merely changed its form, from the sharp, immediate threat of the cavalry to the slow, grinding threat of bureaucratic malice and cultural death. The reservations were often located on the most barren, unproductive land, tracts that white settlers did not want. The government, as part of the treaty agreements, promised to provide annuities, food, blankets, farming equipment, and medical supplies. But this system was notoriously, systemically corrupt. The supplies were often late, of shockingly poor quality, or stolen outright by corrupt government-appointed Indian agents and the politically connected contractors who supplied them. These men grew rich by systematically starving their wards. The people were trapped in a cycle of forced dependency, malnutrition, and despair. European diseases, to which they had no immunity, swept through the crowded, unsanitary agency headquarters, killing thousands. Their very identity was under assault. Their children were often forcibly taken from them by government agents and sent to distant military-style boarding schools whose explicit goal, as articulated by founder Richard Henry Pratt, was to kill the Indian and save the man. At these schools, children were forbidden to speak their native languages. Their long hair, a source of immense cultural and spiritual significance, was unceremoniously cut. Their traditional clothes were replaced with ill-fitting uniforms, and they were beaten savagely for practicing any part of their native culture or religion. It was a systematic, soul-destroying campaign of cultural genocide designed to erase their identity and forcibly assimilate them into the lowest, most despised rung of American society. A similar, though distinct, danger was faced by the thousands of Chinese immigrants who were lured to the West, first by the promise of Gold Mountain during the California Gold Rush, and then by the massive labor demands of the Transcontinental Railroad. They came seeking opportunity, but they found themselves in a land that was deeply, violently, and institutionally hostile to them. They were seen as a source of cheap, efficient, and expendable labor, but also as a strange, alien, and threatening presence by the white population. They were subjected to intense systemic racism at every level of society. The government imposed special foreign miners' taxes on them. They were relegated to working the claims that white miners had already abandoned and were often violently driven off if they happened to find any remaining color. The legal system offered them no protection whatsoever. In 1854, the California Supreme Court, in the landmark case of People vs. Hall, ruled that a person of Chinese descent could not testify in court against a white person. This shocking decision was a green light for violence. It meant that a white man could rob, beat, or even murder a Chinese person in front of a dozen Chinese witnesses, and he could not be convicted because none of those witnesses were legally allowed to stand in a court of law and testify against him. Their voices were silenced by the highest court in the state. This legal impunity led to horrific acts of mass violence. As the railroad was completed and the Western economy soured in the 1870s and 80s, the Chinese became a convenient and defenseless scapegoat for the economic anxieties of the white working class. Labor leaders like Dennis Kearney in San Francisco and ambitious politicians whipped up anti-Chinese hysteria, their speeches filled with racist bile, claiming the Chinese were a coolie labor force that was stealing jobs and lowering wages for hardworking white men. This rhetoric frequently and predictably exploded into violence. In 1871, in Los Angeles, a mob of over 500 white and Hispanic men descended on the city's small Chinatown following a dispute, and in a night of terror, they lynched at least 18 Chinese men and boys, hanging them from storefronts and wagons. In 1885, in Rock Springs, Wyoming, a dispute between white and Chinese coal miners erupted into a full-blown massacre, where a white mob, many of them members of the Knights of Labor Union, killed at least 28 Chinese miners, wounded many more, and burned their entire settlement to the ground, driving the survivors into the freezing wilderness. In 1887, in Hell's Canyon, Oregon, a gang of white horse thieves murdered as many as 34 Chinese gold miners for their gold. In all of these cases, and in dozens of smaller incidents of lynching, arson, and assault across the West, the perpetrators faced few, if any, legal consequences. This was the danger of being an obstacle to manifest destiny, of being deemed racially or culturally inferior by the dominant power structure. Whether you were a Lakota warrior fighting for your ancestral hunting grounds, a respected Hopi elder trying to protect your sacred traditions, or a Chinese laborer trying to earn enough money to send back to your family in Guangdong, you were living in a world that had institutionally defined you as other, as lesser, as an impediment to be removed. Your property, your culture, and your very life could be taken from you, not by a lone outlaw breaking the law, but by a mob, a militia, or a government agent who believed they were enacting the true, unwritten, and foundational law of the land, the law of racial and cultural supremacy. It was a danger that was woven into the very fabric of westward expansion, a foundational violence that the heroic myths of the frontier have worked very, very hard to make us forget. We have navigated a landscape of terrifying physical dangers, from the indifferent, elemental violence of the natural world to the sharp, opportunistic violence of the lawless individual. We have peeked behind the closed doors of the homestead and witnessed the quiet, internal horrors of domestic life, and we have stood in the firelight of the vigilante mob, watching a community's rage curdle into murderous justice. But now we must turn our attention to a danger that was, in many ways, the most insidious, the most widespread, and the most heartbreaking of all. This was a danger that did not attack the body with a bullet or a blizzard, but that attacked the soul with a promise. It was the danger born of hope itself. The West was not just a place of peril, it was a beacon, a vast, open repository for the dreams of millions. The promise of free land under the Homestead Act, the glittering, almost supernatural lure of gold and silver discovered in the mountains, the powerful allure of personal reinvention and a fresh start in a land without a past. These were powerful, irresistible magnets, pulling people from the crowded, disease-ridden, and economically stagnant tenements of the East, from the war-ravaged and impoverished fields of the American South, and from the deeply stratified, famine-haunted, and class-bound villages of the Old World. But this very promise, this shining beacon of hope that illuminated the path westward, was itself a sophisticated, multifaceted, and often deliberately cruel trap. The American West was a landscape built upon a foundation of scams, a continent-sized stage for fraudulent schemes and colossal, life-shattering deceptions. The ultimate danger for the emigrant was not just that they might fail in their endeavor, but that their failure was preordained, meticulously designed, packaged, and sold to them by powerful men and institutions that grew rich on the ashes of their dreams. The greatest, most widespread, and most consequential of these deceptions was the promise of the land itself. The powerful railroad companies, the newly formed state governments, and the battalions of land speculators, often working in concert with the United States government, engaged in a massive, coordinated, and stunningly cynical campaign of propaganda to lure settlers into the Great Plains, the vast semi-arid region that for decades had been known on maps as the Great American Desert. They needed to populate this region. The railroads needed to create markets for their goods and justify the immense federal land grants they had received, vast checkerboards of territory given to them along their rights of way. The states needed a tax base. The speculators needed buyers for the lands they had acquired for pennies an acre. To achieve this, they published and distributed millions of pamphlets, flyers, broadsides, and posters, flooding the cities of the eastern seaboard and the ports of Europe. These documents were not just advertisements. They were works of breathtaking, deliberate, and masterful fiction. Imagine being a German tenant farmer, your family having worked the same small plot of land for a lord for generations, with no hope of ever owning it. Or imagine being an Irish immigrant family, having fled the Great Famine, now living in a single, crowded, lightless room in a New York City tenement, the air thick with coal smoke and disease. A man comes to your neighborhood, a smooth-talking agent from a land company or a railroad, and he hands you a pamphlet. The paper is glossy, the colors are vibrant, the illustrations are lush and bucolic, depicting the plains of Kansas, Nebraska, or the Dakotas, not as the semi-arid, treeless, and climatically brutal region that it was, but as a new Garden of Eden, a land of milk and honey waiting for the virtuous plowman. You see impossibly lush landscapes with deep, rich, black soil that seems to crumble in your hands. You see gentle, rolling hills dotted with mature hardwood trees for building and fuel. You see abundant, sparkling rivers and creeks that flow year-round. You see happy, prosperous families standing proudly before charming, multi-story, white-painted farmhouses made of milled lumber, surrounded by fields of impossibly tall corn, orchards heavy with apples and peaches, and fat, contented livestock grazing peacefully on verdant, knee-high pastures. Every image is a calculated lie, designed to appeal to your deepest, most desperate desires for space, for health, for independence. The text that accompanies these images is even more seductive and deceptive. It cherry-picks weather data, presenting a few unusually wet years in the 1870s as the new permanent climate of the region. Most insidiously, it champions a popular but utterly baseless scientific theory of the day: rain follows the plough. This pseudo-scientific doctrine, promoted with all the fervour of a religious gospel, argued that the very act of human settlement and agriculture would magically and permanently alter the climate. The theory claimed that ploughing the ancient prairie sod would break up the hardpan, allowing rainwater to soak into the earth rather than running off. It argued that the planting of millions of acres of crops and trees would release immense quantities of moisture into the atmosphere through transpiration. Even the smoke from the locomotives and the metallic vibrations of the iron rails themselves were said to induce rainfall. It was a comforting, seductive, and deeply fraudulent idea that gave a scientific gloss to what was essentially a massive, speculative real estate venture. It told you exactly what you wanted to hear: that your hard work, your very presence on the land, was a heroic act that would not just tame the wilderness, but literally terraform it in your favor, making the desert bloom. Convinced by this barrage of evidence, you sell everything you own. You sever all ties with your ancestral home and community. You invest your entire life savings into the arduous, expensive journey west. Your family's hope for the future wrapped up in the promises of a colorful piece of paper. The reality that greets you is a brutal, soul-crushing betrayal. You step off the train or unhitch your exhausted oxen and find yourself in a vast, flat, treeless world, battered by a relentless, nerve-shredding wind and scorched by a sun of an intensity you had never imagined. The deep, rich soil is a tough, impenetrable mat of ancient prairie sod, so dense and interwoven with fibrous roots that it shatters the simple iron plough you brought with you. The abundant rivers are often dry, sandy gulches for 10 months of the year. The promised rain does not follow the plough. Instead, after a few abnormally wet years that serve to lure even more unsuspecting people into the trap, the region's natural, cyclical, and unforgiving drought patterns return with a vengeance. You and your family fight a desperate, heroic, and almost always losing battle. You build your first home from the only material available: the dirt beneath your feet. You live in a dark, damp, insect-infested soddy that is little better than a cave, a home that leaks mud from the ceiling during every rainstorm and provides little comfort against the howling winter winds. You endure biblical plagues of locusts that can descend in a black, buzzing cloud so thick it blots out the sun, devouring an entire year's crop in a single, horrifying afternoon, leaving you with nothing. You face terrifying prairie fires, apocalyptic walls of roaring flame that can sweep across the dry grass faster than a horse can run, incinerating your home, your livestock, and sometimes your family. And you watch, with a creeping, helpless sense of doom, as your crops wither and die in the baked, cracked earth during the long, rainless summers. Thousands upon thousands of families, having poured years of their lives and every penny they had into their claims, are utterly broken. They are defeated not just by the harsh climate, but by the lie that had brought them there. The final, heartbreaking scene of this widespread tragedy is repeated across the plains. A gaunt, defeated family abandoning their claim, packing their few remaining pathetic possessions into their wagon, and painting a bitter, accusatory epitaph on the canvas cover for all to see. In God we trusted, in Kansas we busted. They then begin the long, humiliating journey back east, joining a stream of movers, their faces etched with a shame and failure that was not truly their own. The railroad barons and the land speculators, of course, have already sold the land, made their money, and are busy printing new, even more colourful pamphlets to lure the next wave of hopeful victims. For those drawn west by the even quicker promise of mineral wealth, a different but equally cynical and effective set of scams awaited. The dream of striking it rich, of finding a bonanza that would instantly transform a man from a pauper to a king, created an atmosphere of feverish, irrational hope. This gold fever was a communicable disease that suspended logic, reason, and caution, making men reckless and profoundly gullible. An army of grifters, con artists, and outright frauds emerged to prey upon this desperation. The simplest and most common scam was that of salting a mine. A dishonest prospector would take a worthless claim, a barren patch of rock on a desolate mountainside, and meticulously salt it with gold to create the illusion of a rich deposit. He might fire a shotgun loaded with gold dust into the rock face, embedding tiny, enticing specks of color into the stone. Or he might carefully inject gold filings into a sample of worthless quartz using a turkey baster. He would then present this rich ore sample or show the salted rock face to a naive, newly arrived greenhorn, spinning a tale of a massive, undiscovered vein that he, for some plausible reason, could not develop himself. He would sell the worthless claim for an exorbitant price and then quickly disappear, moving on to the next boomtown to find his next victim. A more sophisticated and far-reaching version of this fraud was the stock market scam. When a new mining district was discovered, hundreds of mining companies would be incorporated almost overnight. Their stock would be listed on the raucous, unregulated exchanges in San Francisco or Denver. The vast majority of these companies were pure fiction, wildcat operations. The promoters might own a small, worthless claim or no claim at all. They would print up thousands of elaborately designed stock certificates, create a lavish prospectus filled with fabricated geological reports and fraudulent assays, and sometimes even build a token piece of mining equipment to create the illusion of a working mine. They would then use rumor and manipulation to create a boom in their company's worthless stock. An investor 1,000 miles away, a doctor in Philadelphia, a clerk in Chicago, a widow in Boston, reading the legitimate news of the riches being pulled from a place like the Comstock Lode, would eagerly buy shares in the consolidated Virginia No. 2, believing they were investing in the next bonanza. In reality, they were buying beautifully printed, worthless paper. Once the promoters had sold enough stock, they would simply dissolve the company and vanish with the investors' money, ruining thousands of families. Even for the legitimate miner who did find gold, the dangers of deception were ever present. The process of separating precious metals from ore required an assayer. While many were honest, a corrupt one could ruin a small, independent miner. He could be secretly in the pocket of a powerful local mill owner. When the small miner brought in his hard-won ore, the assayer would conduct a fraudulent test, deliberately undervaluing the sample. The miner, trusting the scientific report, would sell his ore for a fraction of its true worth. The assayer and the mill owner would then split the stolen profit. This was a quiet, insidious form of theft, a crime committed with a crucible and a ledger book instead of a gun. From the grand, national lie of a temperate, fertile prairie to the small, grubby deception of a salted mine, the West was a landscape of broken promises. It was a world where hope was a commodity, expertly packaged, advertised, and sold to the desperate. The danger was not just that your dreams might not come true, it was that your dreams were being actively and cynically used as a weapon against you, wielded by powerful and ruthless men who understood that the easiest and most profitable thing to mine in the West was not the gold in the ground, but the hope in a man's heart. We have navigated a landscape of terrifying physical dangers, from the indifferent, elemental violence of the natural world to the sharp, opportunistic violence of the lawless individual, the quiet, internal horrors born of isolation and the crushing weight of societal expectations and the systemic brutality of manifest destiny. But now we must turn our attention to another, perhaps more ancient and primal layer of danger, one that existed long before the first wagon wheel cut a rut into the prairie sod, before the first bullet was fired in anger, and before the first false promise of land ownership was made. This was the danger posed by the original inhabitants of the land. Not the human ones, with whom conflict was complex and often tragic, but the non-human ones. The West was not an empty landscape waiting to be filled by human ambition. It was a vibrant, teeming, and often brutally competitive ecosystem, populated by a vast menagerie of creatures for whom the newly arrived humans were a clumsy, noisy, fragrant, and sometimes, all too often, an edible intrusion. For the pioneer, the cowboy, the prospector, the soldier, and the displaced Native American alike, the daily reality was a constant, wary, and often exhausting negotiation with a world of fang, claw, venom, stampeding hoof, and suffocating swarm. Forgetting for a moment the grand, romantic predators that haunt our cinematic imagination, the most lethal, persistent, and psychologically taxing threats were often small, insidious, ubiquitous, and utterly unavoidable. This was a war fought not on the open battlefields of forts and skirmishes, but in the intimate, vulnerable spaces of daily life, in bedrolls, in root cellars, in water sources, in the very air they breathed, and with every single step taken upon the untamed earth. The single most feared, most universally respected, and most widely despised creature in the entire Western territories, from the arid deserts of the southwest to the grassy plains of the north, was not the grizzly bear or the mountain lion, but the rattlesnake. They were a ubiquitous and terrifyingly democratic peril, a danger that did not discriminate by wealth, status, or intention. They were equally likely to be found sunning themselves on the dusty stoop of a Texas ranch house, a place of supposed domestic safety, coiled in the cool, dark, and inviting corner of a Nebraska sod house, a place of perceived shelter, or hidden perfectly, camouflaged against the ochre and grey palette of the landscape under a mesquite bush in an Arizona canyon. The West was home to numerous species, each a master of its own deadly craft, each evolved over millennia to thrive in its specific niche. The Western diamondback, large, aggressive, and possessing a formidable quantity of potent hemotoxic venom. The prairie rattler, smaller but incredibly widespread across the Central Plains. The sidewinder of the arid deserts, with its peculiar sideways locomotion that left a distinctive wavy track and allowed it to move efficiently across loose sand. And the Mojave green, perhaps the most feared of all, possessing a complex venom that was a deadly cocktail of both hemotoxin, destroying tissue, capillaries, and red blood cells, and a potent neurotoxin, attacking the nervous system and leading to paralysis and respiratory failure. But they all shared the same terrifying, shared characteristics, a masterful camouflage that could render them practically invisible against the natural colors of the landscape, making them a deadly surprise, a lightning-fast strike that was a blur of motion delivered with astonishing accuracy, and a sophisticated, injectable venom designed not just to kill, but to begin digesting their prey from the inside out, making it easier to swallow and absorb. The danger was constant, a low-grade, humming anxiety that informed every movement made outside the perceived safety of a dwelling. A homesteader's wife, her hands raw from lye soap and relentless labor, reaching into a dark root cellar for sustenance or gathering firewood from a forgotten stack, could feel a sudden, sharp, hypodermic sting on her hand or forearm. The dry, buzzing, electric rattle, the snake's terrifying warning, would sound only after the bite had already been delivered, a cruel, mocking postscript to a disaster already in progress. A cowboy dismounting his horse in tall, dry grass at dusk to relieve himself or to make camp could feel a stab of searing fire in his calf. A child chasing a rabbit or exploring a rocky outcrop could step on one, mistaking the rattle for the buzz of an insect. A man sleeping on the ground in his bedroll, seeking a moment's respite from the trail, could awake to find he had a silent, cold-blooded bedfellow, and any sudden movement would be a fatal mistake. The experience of a venomous snakebite was horrific and universally dreaded. A searing, white-hot, almost electric pain would erupt from the two tiny puncture wounds, a pain far out of proportion to the small injury, spreading rapidly along the limb. Within minutes, a rapid, grotesque, and deeply alarming swelling would begin as the hemotoxic enzymes started their insidious work, dissolving blood vessel walls and destroying muscle tissue. The victim's limb would turn a dark, bruised, purplish black, the swelling migrating steadily up the arm or leg, often into the torso. Nausea and violent convulsive vomiting would set in, followed by a terrifying difficulty in breathing as the venom began to affect the diaphragm and lungs. Vision would blur, the world would seem to spin in a nauseating vertigo, and a strange, metallic taste would fill the mouth. There was no effective medical treatment on the frontier. The range of folk remedies was a grim catalogue of desperate, painful, and utterly useless actions. The victim's companion, or the victim himself, might slice the wound open in a crosshatch pattern with an unsterilized knife and try to suck the venom out, a process that often led to a fatal infection for the victim and could poison the rescuer through tiny cuts on their lips or in their mouth. They might pour black gunpowder into the wound and set it on fire in a misguided attempt to cauterize the poison, or the most common prescription of all, dousing the victim with copious amounts of whiskey, a central nervous system depressant that could actually hasten death by slowing the heart and respiration, making the venom's work even more efficient. In reality, all a person could do was lie down, pray, and try to remain as still and calm as possible to keep their heart rate from pumping the venom through their system faster. It was a race against time, a desperate contest between the body's resilience and the venom's lethal efficiency. A bite from a large, mature rattlesnake, particularly if it was a defensive strike where the snake, feeling threatened, delivered a full, angry dose of venom, was very often a death sentence. A slow, agonizing, and profoundly lonely death on the prairie, perhaps with one's family watching helplessly as the swelling progressed and the breathing grew shallow and ragged. Every single step a person took in the West, from the moment they rose in the morning to the moment they lay down at night, was shadowed by this ever-present possibility. Beyond the snakes, the world was alive with smaller, equally persistent miseries that could escalate into life-threatening conditions. The insects of the West were not just a nuisance, they were a plague of biblical proportions, a constant, irritating enemy. Swarms of biting flies, horseflies, deerflies, black flies, could torment livestock to the point of madness, causing them to run wildly, injuring themselves on fences and rocks, or losing so much blood and becoming so exhausted that they became worthless. Mosquitoes, breeding by the billions in the stagnant pools of prairie wallows, along slow-moving rivers, and in any standing water, were not just an itchy annoyance. They were carriers of malaria, then known colloquially as ague or the shakes, and other debilitating fevers that could incapacitate an entire family for weeks, leaving them too weak to tend their crops, care for their livestock, or even fetch water. And then there were the arachnids, silent, venomous invaders of the domestic and outdoor space. The black widow spider, with its distinctive crimson hourglass marking on its abdomen and its potent neurotoxin, was a common dweller in the dark, cool, protected corners of root cellars, outhouses, privies, and woodpiles. Its bite, while rarely fatal to a healthy adult, caused severe, debilitating muscle cramps, abdominal rigidity, nausea, sweating, and excruciating pain that could last for days. It was far more dangerous to small children, the elderly, or those with compromised immune systems. The scorpion, particularly the small and highly venomous Arizona bark scorpion, was a common, unwelcome visitor in boots left on the floor overnight in bedding or in piles of discarded clothing. A man waking in the morning might shake out his boots as a matter of habit and find one scuttling out, its stinger poised. Its sting, while usually not deadly, caused searing, electric pain, numbness, and, in the very young or old, potential respiratory failure and paralysis. And then there were the great predators, the beasts of legend that ruled the mountains, the deep forests, and the canyons of the West. The grizzly bear was the undisputed, terrifying apex predator, a creature that inspired a level of primal awe and abject fear unmatched by any other animal. It was a creature of immense size, unpredictable and often foul temperament, and shocking, deceptive speed. A mature grizzly could weigh over 1,000 pounds, stand 8 or 9 feet tall on its hind legs, and run faster than a horse for short distances. Unlike the smaller and more timid black bear, which would almost always flee from humans if given the chance, the grizzly was notoriously aggressive, territorial, and would often attack without provocation, especially a sow protecting her cubs or a bear defending a kill. A prospector working a remote stream, his senses dulled by the sound of the rushing water, or a hunter tracking elk through dense timber could stumble upon a grizzly with no warning, its massive form suddenly erupting from the undergrowth. An attack was an act of shocking, overwhelming, explosive violence. The bear would maul its victim with its powerful forelimbs, its 5-inch claws, not sharp like a cat's, but blunt and thick like digging tools, capable of breaking bones and gouging out huge chunks of flesh. A single bite from its massive jaws, lined with teeth designed for crushing bone and tearing meat, could crush a human skull like an eggshell. To survive a grizzly attack was to be left horrifically mutilated for life, your face torn away, your scalp ripped off, your limbs shattered and useless. More often than not, there was no survival. The victim was simply consumed. The mountain lion, also known as the cougar or puma, was a different, more spectral kind of threat. It was a silent, ghost-like predator, a master of the ambush, rarely seen until the moment of its attack. Its tawny coat provided perfect camouflage in the rocky, scrub-covered hills and canyons. While attacks on adult humans were rare, they were not unheard of, particularly on a lone traveler at dusk or dawn, or a child playing unattended near a homestead. More commonly, they were a devastating threat to a homesteader's livelihood. A single cougar could silently leap into a corral at night, killing half a dozen sheep or a valuable calf, not necessarily for food, but in a frenzy of predatory instinct, leaving behind a scene of carnage that could financially ruin a small rancher. The wolf, particularly the large and highly intelligent grey wolf or lobo, was another constant menace to ranchers and homesteaders across the plains and in the mountain territories. They hunted in organized, disciplined packs, displaying a cunning and coordinated strategy that seemed almost human in its intelligence. They would test fences for weak spots, send out decoys to lure away guard dogs, and work together to panic and scatter a herd of cattle, separating a young calf or a weakened adult from the safety of the group, driving them towards exhaustion or into treacherous terrain. For the homesteader, the sound of wolves howling in the deep, freezing darkness of a winter night was not a romantic call of the wild. It was the sound of a direct and immediate threat to his family's survival, the sound of his wealth and his future being eaten alive just outside the thin, earthen walls of his cabin. Finally, there was the danger posed by the great herds of herbivores themselves. We have spoken of the terror of a cattle stampede, a localized whirlwind of panic. But the original bison herds were a force of nature on an entirely different and almost unimaginable scale. A migrating herd, a river of brown, could be 50 miles long and 20 miles wide, containing millions upon millions of animals. It was less a herd and more a slow-motion, living glacier, a geological event on legs, a force that reshaped the very landscape as it moved, churning up the earth and consuming every blade of grass in its path. A pioneer family in their small, fragile wagon, caught directly in the path of such a migration, could do nothing but watch in paralyzed terror as the sea of brown fur flowed around them. The ground would tremble for miles, the noise a deafening combination of grunts, bellows, and the thunder of millions of hooves. The danger was that the herd could shift unpredictably, the panicked animals pushing their neighbors forward, and the wagon, the oxen, and the family could be simply swept up, overturned, and trampled into the earth, utterly annihilated by the sheer, unthinking, unstoppable mass of the herd. Even a lone bull bison, separated from the herd, perhaps driven by hunger or territorial rage, was an incredibly dangerous animal. Weighing over a ton, with a thick skull and massive sharp horns, and capable of surprising speed and agility, it could easily gore a horse, flip a wagon with a casual toss of its massive, lowered head, or simply stand its ground stubbornly, blocking a trail for hours and forcing a traveler into a dangerous detour through unknown, potentially more hazardous territory. The West was, in essence, an animal kingdom, and the newly arrived humans were, for the first time in a long while for many of them, no longer at the apex of the food chain. They were participants, often unwilling ones, in a complex and brutal web of life and death, where a moment of inattention, a misplaced step, a lapse in vigilance, or a bit of sheer, random bad luck could result in a horrifying, painful, and profoundly lonely end. The land and its myriad creatures were a constant, daily, and humbling reminder of humanity's shocking fragility, a terrifying truth that shaped the psyche of everyone who ventured into its domain and, against all odds, survived to tell the tale. We have come to the end of our long, dark, and dusty journey. We have stood together under the vast, indifferent sky of the Great Plains and felt the crushing weight of its scale, a psychological force that could erode the human soul. We have navigated the treacherous, unmapped territories of a lawless society, a world where the line between the protector and the predator was often a convenient fiction, drawn in the sand and erased by the first wind. We have peered into the dark, claustrophobic confines of the sod house and the mining camp, witnessing the quiet, internal horrors born of profound isolation, desperate greed, and maddening despair. We have confronted the institutionalized violence of a nation convinced of its own manifest destiny, a righteous, inexorable force that sought to erase entire peoples and cultures from the face of the land they had inhabited for millennia. We have been ensnared by the glittering, false promises of land speculators and mining promoters who understood that the most valuable ore in the West was not gold or silver, but the hope glittering in a poor man's eye. And we have felt the primal, reptilian fear of a world teeming with fang, claw, venom, and stampeding hoof, a world where humanity was not the master, but just another participant in a brutal food chain. Now, in this final chapter, we must confront the ultimate, overarching danger, the one that connected all the others, the final destination to which all these perilous roads led. This was the profound and devastating collapse of the human body itself, breaking under the accumulated, crushing weight of all these relentless pressures. The ultimate danger of the West was not just the swift, dramatic finality of death, but the slow, grinding, and often agonizing process of disease, malnutrition, medical ignorance, and physical decay that consumed so many, long before a bullet, a blizzard, a rattlesnake, or a rope could claim them. This was the final, intimate war, fought not against outlaws or the landscape, but against the body's own treacherous architecture in a world determined to break it. The 19th century American West was, for all intents and purposes, a world without modern medicine. It was a pre-scientific, pre-germ theory world, a lottery of microbes where illness was a mysterious and terrifying force, often attributed to a foul miasma rising from the earth, an imbalance of the body's four humors, a weakness in one's moral character, or the inscrutable will of a punishing god. The most basic principles of sanitation and hygiene were utterly unknown or ignored. This ignorance transformed the great overland trails, the Oregon, the California, the Santa Fe, into 2,000-mile-long vectors of disease. The crowded, filthy campsites used by thousands of people and their livestock week after week became perfect incubators. With no established latrines, human and animal waste contaminated the ground and, inevitably, the water sources. The result was catastrophic, explosive outbreaks of cholera, the most feared and deadly disease on the trail. Imagine a wagon train at dawn. A family is healthy, hopeful, making breakfast. By noon, a child complains of a stomach ache. By mid-afternoon, they are in the throes of a violent, uncontrollable rice water diarrhea and convulsive vomiting that purges the body of all its essential fluids in a matter of hours. The victim suffers from excruciating full-body muscle cramps as their electrolytes are depleted. Their skin, once warm, becomes cold, clammy, and takes on a terrifying bluish-grey hue from the profound dehydration. Their eyes sink deep into their sockets, their features become pinched and sharp, a horrifying death mask known as the facies cholerica. The thirst is absolute, agonizing, yet every sip of water is violently expelled. Death from hypovolemic shock often comes before the next sunrise. The disease could scythe through a wagon train with the speed and lethality of a forest fire, turning a community of hopeful pioneers into a frantic, paranoid funeral procession. The psychological terror it induced was as potent as the physical disease. It was an invisible, silent enemy that could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. Every shared cup, every handshake, every moment of contact became a potential death sentence. The dead were buried in shallow, hasty graves along the trail, their names carved on a simple wooden board, a grave that would likely be uncovered by wolves before the last wagon was out of sight. Beyond the trail, other diseases flourished in the unsanitary conditions of the boomtowns and early settlements. Typhoid fever, another waterborne illness, was rampant, causing a prolonged, debilitating fever that often led to delirium and intestinal hemorrhage. Malaria, then known simply as ague or the shakes, was endemic in the marshy river bottoms, its cyclical, bone-rattling chills and drenching, feverish sweats leaving its victims permanently weakened, anemic, and susceptible to any other opportunistic infection. Smallpox, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and measles, all common childhood diseases in the more populated East, were devastatingly lethal when introduced to isolated frontier communities where no one had prior immunity. A single sick traveler passing through a remote mining camp could initiate a chain reaction of death, an epidemic that would burn through the population, leaving dozens dead in its wake. Compounding this constant threat of infectious disease was the pervasive, inescapable reality of chronic malnutrition. The diet of the trail, the cattle drive, the mining camp, and the early homestead was a monotonous, unbalanced, and profoundly unhealthy trinity of coffee, bacon or salt pork, and some form of bread, biscuits, sourdough, or the jaw-breaking hardtack. Fresh fruits and vegetables were a forgotten luxury, almost entirely non-existent for months, sometimes years on end. This profound lack of essential vitamins and nutrients led to a host of debilitating and grotesque deficiency diseases. Scurvy, a horrifying disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a common affliction, especially during the long winters. Its symptoms were a slow-motion bodily collapse. A profound lethargy and depression would set in first, followed by bleeding gums that would become swollen, purple, and spongy. Teeth would loosen in their sockets and fall out. The joints would swell with excruciating pain. Most terrifyingly, old, long-healed wounds and broken bones would spontaneously reopen, the scar tissue dissolving as the body lost its ability to produce collagen. A man might survive a gunshot wound, only to die months later as the wound itself unraveled. Scurvy was a disease that unmade the body, returning it to its constituent broken parts. Other deficiencies were just as grim. Pellagra, from a lack of niacin, caused the 3 Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, and dementia. Anemia was chronic and widespread. This constant state of malnutrition acted as a force multiplier for every other danger, weakening the body's immune system and making every cut, every cough, every fever a potentially fatal event. The physical labor itself was a form of slow, grinding, bodily destruction. The cowboy's life in the saddle, often for 16 hours a day, led to chronic back pain, crippling arthritis in the knees and hips, and painful hernias from lifting heavy saddles and wrestling calves. The miner's work underground, breathing in fine silica dust year after year, led inevitably to the fatal, suffocating horror of silicosis, a disease that literally turned the lungs to stone. The homesteader's endless toil of sod-busting, well-digging, and fence-building led to ruptured discs, debilitating strains, and exhaustion so profound it was a disease in itself. And when the inevitable accident did happen, a leg crushed by a spooked horse, a hand mangled in primitive farm machinery, a premature dynamite blast in a mine shaft, a deep gash from an axe slipping on frozen wood, the medical response was a terrifying journey back to the dark ages of medicine. There were very few formally trained doctors in the West, and the quality of those who were there was wildly inconsistent. Many so-called doctors were quacks and charlatans, men who had failed elsewhere and came west to prey on the desperate and the ignorant. They traveled in wagons, selling patent medicines, colorful bottles filled with alcohol, opium, cocaine, and useless vegetable matter that promised to cure everything from consumption to cancer. For a serious injury like a compound fracture where the bone pierced the skin, infection was not a risk, it was a near certainty. With no understanding of germ theory, a frontier surgeon would operate with unwashed hands and unsterilized instruments, often on a dirty kitchen table in a sod house, surrounded by flies. The only reliable tool in his blood-stained leather satchel was the amputation saw. A shattered limb would be removed with brutal efficiency, the arteries tied off with a piece of string, and the stump often cauterized with a red-hot branding iron from the fire. The patient, if he was lucky, would be given a massive dose of laudanum or enough whiskey to render him semi-conscious. But many were simply held down by 4 strong men. Survival of such a procedure was rare. Death from shock, blood loss, or the subsequent, raging, gangrenous infection was the norm. The West was a land of ghosts and a land of cripples. Even childbirth, a natural process, was a life-threatening ordeal for women on the frontier. With no access to doctors or proper medical care, women relied on local, untrained midwives whose knowledge was a fragile mixture of practical experience and dangerous folk superstition. A difficult birth, a breech presentation, a tangled umbilical cord, or a prolonged, exhausting labor was a crisis that could easily result in the death of both mother and child. Postpartum hemorrhage could drain a woman's life away in a matter of minutes, with no one knowing how to stop it. Puerperal fever, or childbed fever, a postpartum infection caused by unsanitary conditions and unwashed hands, was a common and deadly killer, turning the miracle of birth into a week-long feverish tragedy. The quiet, overgrown pioneer cemeteries scattered across the plains and mountains are filled with the graves of young women who died in their 20s and 30s, often buried alongside the infant who cost them their life. The maternal mortality rate was staggeringly, heartbreakingly high. This constant, intimate proximity to sickness, injury, and a painful, protracted death shaped the Western psyche in profound ways. It bred a deep, abiding fatalism, a stoic acceptance that life was fragile and could be extinguished at any moment by forces far beyond one's control. It also bred a fierce, almost fanatical self-reliance, the absolute knowledge that when a crisis came, a sick child, a broken bone, a difficult birth, there would be no one to help you but yourself, your spouse, and perhaps a distant, equally struggling neighbor. And it created a deep-seated distrust of strangers, who were not just potential criminals, but potential carriers of a deadly, invisible disease. So what are we left with at the end of this long, dark, and brutal trail? We are left with a picture of the American West that is far removed from the simple, clean, heroic myth. It was not a land of noble heroes and clear-cut villains. It was a chaotic, brutal, and stunningly dangerous world where the primary struggle was not for glory or for justice, but for simple, raw, day-to-day survival. It was a world where you could be lied to and lured into a place that was designed, by its very nature, to kill you. It was a world where you could survive the 6-month journey, only to be murdered for your boots by a desperate man, or to be swindled out of your life savings by a con artist in a fancy suit, or to be hanged by a mob of your own neighbors. It was a world where you could overcome all human threats, only to be killed by a snake, a bear, a blizzard, a flash flood, or a single drop of contaminated water. It was a world where the quiet, oppressive loneliness could shatter your mind, and where your own body, beset by hunger and disease, could betray you in the most intimate and agonizing ways. The profound, overarching danger of the West was its sheer, cumulative, and unforgiving weight. It was the relentless, daily assault of a dozen different threats, big and small, natural and human, that wore a person down, eroded their health, frayed their nerves, and chipped away at their soul until there was nothing left. The true story of the West is not a story of triumph, but a story of endurance against overwhelming odds. The real heroes of that world were not the famous gunslingers or the legendary lawmen whose names we remember. They were the anonymous, ordinary men and women who faced this multi-front war every single day and somehow, against all logic and probability, managed to wake up the next morning and face it all over again. The myth of the West is a clean, simple story of conquest. The reality of the West was a messy, complicated, and deeply tragic story of survival. A story written not in glory, but in sweat, in blood, in tears, and in the countless, forgotten, unmarked graves that lie scattered across its vast, beautiful, and profoundly unforgiving landscape. And so, our journey is at an end. The dust of the trail settles. The echo of the last gunshot fades into a profound and lasting silence. The flickering campfire, around which we have gathered to hear these dark tales, now burns down to embers, its warmth receding, leaving us in the cool, quiet dark of our own time. It is time to return from that vast, brutal, and myth-haunted landscape, but we cannot return unchanged. The air in the room you are in now should feel different. The simple, certain safety of it, the solid walls, the steady light, the absence of a ceaseless, whining wind, should feel less like a given and more like a fragile, precious miracle. We have walked through a world where every single one of those certainties was a desperate, unfulfilled dream, and the ghosts of that world have followed us back. We began this journey by challenging a myth, and in its place we have built a monument to a terrifying reality. We have seen that the greatest danger was the land itself, a continent of crushing scale, of thirst and freezing cold, a landscape that was not a backdrop for human drama, but an active, indifferent antagonist that could kill a family with a drought or a blizzard. We saw how that vast emptiness created a vacuum of law, a world where justice was a rumor and a man's life was worth as little as the contents of his pockets, where the line between the lawman and the criminal was a convenient, shifting fiction. We have stood in the stirrups of the cowboy, not as a romantic hero, but as a marginalized, often brutalized laborer, trapped in a cycle of violence that he both suffered and inflicted, a pawn in a vast criminal enterprise of beef and land. We have descended into the suffocating subterranean darkness of the mines and stood on the treacherous, avalanche-swept slopes of the railroad grades, witnessing how the great industrial dream of the West was built, quite literally, upon the broken and unmourned bodies of its workers. We have dared to look behind the closed door of the isolated homestead, to see not a family united in noble struggle, but a claustrophobic pressure cooker where loneliness could curdle into madness and domestic tyranny reigned unchecked and unseen. We have stood in the torchlight of the vigilante mob, and we have seen how a community's legitimate thirst for order could become a terrifying, hypocritical, and irreversible act of collective murder. We have seen that the shining promise of manifest destiny was, for the native peoples who stood in its path, a euphemism for a deliberate and systematic apocalypse of ecological warfare, starvation, and cultural genocide. We have seen how that same promise of progress defined other peoples, like the Chinese, as legally less than human, their lives and labor expendable, their murders unworthy of justice. We saw how hope itself was weaponized, how the promise of free land and easy gold was a carefully crafted lie, a colossal scam designed to fleece the desperate and the hopeful, leaving them broken and busted on the very land they were told would be their salvation. And finally, we saw the quiet, unglamorous, and most pervasive danger of all, the simple biological collapse of the human body, beset by disease, malnutrition, and medical ignorance in a world that offered no comfort and no cure. This is the West that was, a world of constant overlapping and interwoven dangers, a brutal ecosystem of death where a man might survive the cholera only to be killed for his horse, or survive a grizzly attack only to die of scurvy, or build a successful ranch only to be hanged by a mob of his jealous neighbors. So why, after all this, does the myth endure? Why do we still cling to the image of the stoic, independent hero in a world we now know was defined by desperate interdependence, corruption, and systemic violence? The answer is simple and profound. The myth was necessary. The reality of westward expansion was too ugly, too costly, too steeped in cruelty and failure to be the foundational story of a great nation. The country needed a simpler, cleaner, more heroic narrative to justify the immense human and moral cost of its own creation. It needed to transform a chaotic, often shameful, and deeply complex reality into a simple morality play of civilization conquering savagery, of order taming chaos, of good triumphing over evil. And so, the rough edges were sanded down. The failures were forgotten, the victims were silenced, the complexities were flattened. The cowboy, often a troubled and violent youth, was remade into a knight of the plains. The homesteader's desperate, losing battle with the climate was recast as a triumphant tale of rugged individualism. The genocidal campaigns against the Native Americans were framed as heroic Indian wars. A century of cinema and popular literature then poured a final, thick, romantic gloss over this sanitized foundation until the myth became more real, more solid, and infinitely more powerful than the history it had replaced. And we live with the ghosts of that reality and the power of that myth every single day. The myth of the rugged, self-reliant individual forged in this supposed crucible of self-sufficiency still echoes in our most contentious political debates about the role of government and community. The idea of the West as an empty wilderness to be conquered and exploited continues to inform our relationship with the natural world, a relationship fraught with peril as the consequences of that conquest, drought, fire, ecological collapse, come home to roost. The American fascination with the gun, the notion of a lone citizen as the ultimate arbiter of justice, is a direct cultural descendant of that lawless world where self-preservation was the only law that mattered. The legacy of Manifest Destiny is not in the past, it lives on in the ongoing struggles for justice and sovereignty by Native American nations, and in the continuing debates over immigration and racial identity. The boom and bust cycle of the mining towns, the culture of speculation, and the promise of instant wealth is a pattern that has repeated itself again and again in the American economy. The West was not won. The word implies a clean victory in a noble contest. It was endured, it was survived by a few, and it consumed the many. It was a crucible that forged certain aspects of the national character, resilience, ingenuity, and a capacity for great hope, yes, but also a profound capacity for violence, for ruthless exploitation, for racial prejudice, and for a willful, convenient blindness to the immense human cost of progress. The vast, silent spaces of the American West that you can still visit today are not truly empty. They are full. They are full of the ghosts of the homesteaders who died of heartbreak and starvation, of the Chinese railroad workers buried in unmarked graves in the mountains, of the Lakota warriors who died defending their way of life, of the women who died in childbirth in a lonely sod house, of the thousands upon thousands of forgotten souls whose stories were deemed too inconvenient, too tragic, or too grim for the triumphant myth. Their silence is the true sound of the West. Our journey is over. The pin we dropped on the map of our own time seems brighter now, a small point of light and order in the darkness we have just explored. The hum of your refrigerator, the glow of your screen, the simple, profound peace of a night uninterrupted by the howl of a wolf or the crack of a pistol. These are the true luxuries of the modern age. We have walked through the valley of the shadow of 1,000 deaths, and we have, mercifully, returned. Thank you for listening.